Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We're really pleased that you're joining us this evening for what should be a fantastic, interesting, and hopefully challenging program as well, and motivating program, while we talk about how long will I wait, all about understanding uncertainty on the waiting list. So before we go in to look at some of the slides, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Irena. So Irena is a professor in health science at Krakow University with a background in organ donation and particularly a specialist in heart transplantation and mechanical cardiac support and thoracic transplant recipients. So a really wide range of things here. So that's great. So thank you for joining us, Irena. And for me, my name is Fiona Loud, and I am Policy Director for the UK Kidney Patient Support Charity, and I'm also the recipient of a kidney 14 years ago now from my husband after 5 years on dialysis. So this webinar has been organised by the TLJ2 Learning Workstream, and it's led by a group of ESOT, so European Society of Transplantation leaders from a range of groups. And what we've got is a free series of webinars for you to get into. The one tonight about how long will I wait, and one next week on the 5th of November that you can sign up for. The programme itself concerns the main concerns of transplantations, the results from a great European survey that was run earlier this year, fear of graft rejection, all about an open conversation, uncertainty and illness. So that full programme is open to anybody to join, and there's a very special, very low cost for patients to get involved with that. I'd just like to tell you a little bit more about inviting you to join that. And there's the link you can see at the bottom of the screen to get involved with education that's probably very timely now, given where we are in the pandemic, given how many things are changing. Going on to this learning journey is something that we're all a part of, and I do think that you'd learn a lot if you signed up to that and listened in to to this webinar and some of the forthcoming webinars as well, which are themselves free. So now on to tonight's webinar. Irena is going to soon say a little bit more about the programme itself for this evening, but just to let you know a couple of things. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat box for any technical issues, but also you can see the Q&A, and we'd love to get your questions as we go through the talks this evening. So if you could put the questions in the Q&A, that would be great. And if you have any technical concerns or issues, perhaps put those in the chat box. That would be great. So before we start, before I give the floor to Irena to talk about the programme, we'd like to know a bit more about you, our audience tonight. So we've got a short poll that you can see that's going to run for a few seconds. So you have to be quite quick, but have a look and just perhaps click what kind of a person you are. We can get an idea of who we're talking to. And of course, I'm trying to fill it out and I've just realised I can't because I'm a presenter. So we'll let that run for a moment. And then as soon as that's done, we'll be able to start to get into this evening. So it's a bit of an exciting moment to hear who's on there. So let's have a look at who we've got. So we've got quite a few others. We've got quite a few organ recipients, which is great. And again, a sort of fairly equal number of people who are healthcare professionals, both being doctors and nurses, transplant coordinators as well. So that's nearly half of the people here. So that's great. So it's great to know we've got that mixed audience there as well. So what I'd like to now do is just pass over briefly to Irena, who's going to talk you through tonight's programme. Irena.
Thank you, Fiona. Good evening, everyone. Thank you again. Thank you very much for joining for our exciting webinar. I would like to introduce our program and our speaker for today. So our first speaker is Hannah Maple from UK, and she will present the presentation about uncertainty from the clinician perspective. The next one is Pisana Ferrari from Italy, and she will talk about uncertainty from the patient perspective. At the end of our webinar, we will have a question and answer session with ample room for discussion. And we concluding remarks after our webinar. So now we will start with our program. And Fiona, please introduce our first speaker.
Thank you very much. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Hannah Maypole from the UK. So Hannah is a transplant and general surgeon. She's in the final year of training at Guy's Hospital in London, a hospital I'm quite familiar with myself, although I didn't have my transplant there, I have to say. She's also a clinical lecturer, does research in all sorts of health psychology as applied to healthcare and transplantation, and where she's also particularly interested in living donor transplantation or donation. So over to you, Hannah, to talk about uncertainty from the clinician's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. So yes, it gives me great pleasure to present the clinician's perspective on what I think is a very interesting and relevant topic at the moment. Those are my disclosures, and please feel free to share my talk on social media if you'd like to. So why are we talking about uncertainty? Well, essentially the basis of this was from a survey that was conducted with the European Transplant Patients Organisation and ESOT. And them into the activities of ESOT to improve patients' knowledge and life satisfaction, and also to encourage collaboration between patients and transplant professionals. And the results of this survey essentially showed that uncertainty is the #1 priority for patients, and that's at all stages of the transplant process. So why is uncertainty a part of transplantation? Well, from my perspective, I think transplantation involves more than just one person. It involves both the donor and the recipient. And it's also this separate entity of the donated organ, and the availability of those organs is unpredictable. For me, this makes transplantation a fascinating specialty to be a part of, and I, for definite, caught the transplant bug very young and very early in my medical career. But I think we must acknowledge that, unfortunately, uncertainty is a big part of what we do. And the list of questions there are some of the things that we get commonly asked when we see patients in the clinic at different stages of their care. But I think what is perhaps reassuring is the fact that the questions that the patients ask us are very similar to the questions that we ask on your behalf. And a lot of the things that you worry about, we worry about as well. So it's reassuring to know that we are all on the same page. So what makes waiting for a transplant so difficult? Well, I think you can divide it up into 3 different sections. The first is the physical impact, and that's really with having to live with the symptoms of an illness, and that's whilst you're waiting for definitive treatment. There's also the risk of your health deteriorating, and also the importance of trying to stay healthy. And we all know how difficult it is to stay fit and healthy, and that's even without dealing with chronic illness and symptoms. From a psychological perspective, when you look through the literature, there's quite a lot of psychological burden in waiting for a transplant. It's incredibly stressful. It's a very anxious time, and some patients do suffer with issues with their mood. And also, one thing that I hadn't really thought about until I delved into this topic in a bit more detail, and that's the issue of guilt. And there's a lot of interesting work that's looked at the issue of guilt and how looking forward to a transplant is associated sort of with looking forward to somebody else dying. And it's not, whilst the two are not, you're not thinking about somebody else's death necessarily, being called in for a transplant really brings home the fact that another person has passed away. And for some patients, that's quite difficult. On the social side, there is a feeling that life is on hold, and that you're waiting for life to properly begin after having a transplant, because hopefully with a transplant, the symptoms and all the other effects that illness has on somebody's life are hopefully significantly reduced. I think it's also important to acknowledge that experiences of patients is likely to be different for the different organs that individuals are waiting for. If you're waiting for a heart, some lungs or a liver, there is a more immediate threat to life, which means that the options are more limited, as is time, and a lot of the issues that are being dealt with are far more acute. From a kidney perspective, there's always the option of dialysis, and also living donation is a feasible option for some patients. And that means that patients do have a bit more time. They do have different options. But on the flip side, the chronicity of illness and being on the waiting list for a long period of time, sometimes many, many years, that's more of a problem than for the other organ recipient groups. And I think generally, as a human being, dealing with uncertainty is difficult. I'm somebody who quite likes being organised. I like knowing what I'm doing from day to day or week to week. And I find it difficult enough not knowing what I'm doing next week. I can't imagine how difficult it must be waiting for an indefinite period of time for an organ. And I anticipate that this type of uncertainty is even more difficult, and I can't be 100% sure how exactly I would cope if I was waiting for a transplant. I think from the clinician's perspective, I think it is difficult for us as well, albeit in a slightly different way. We like reassuring our patients, especially we like facts, we like being able to provide accurate and realistic information. And we also like a degree of predictability. It's much more comfortable and far less stressful if you know the situation in depth, and if you can be honest and open and realistic about managing patients' expectations. And sometimes with transplantation, that's quite difficult. So you might be asking yourself, well, why would you go into transplantation if it's difficult? Well, to be honest, we like transplanting patients. We believe in transplantation. The transplant community is quite a close-knit one, and almost universally we are all striving for the same goal, and that is to try and transplant as many people as we possibly can who needs an organ. It does require a lot of thought about lots of different factors, and whilst this is very challenging, it is hugely rewarding, and I think that's similarly the case for transplant patients as well. I just wanted to talk briefly about COVID. I know most people are probably slightly bored of having to listen to talks about people mentioning COVID, but I don't really think that we can discuss uncertainty without it being on the agenda. So I think COVID-19 for everybody has been a really difficult time. There are a number of frustrated patients on the waiting list, especially the kidney cohort. My experience is mainly in kidneys in the UK. And a lot of patients were up in arms about the fact that we had to reduce or stop our transplant programme. But I think, again, there is an overlap with the clinicians, and that we were also very frustrated that we weren't able to do our job in the way that we're used to. And we've been very frustrated by some of the limitations that have been necessary as a result of COVID. I just wanted to emphasise the clinical problem, and that really is this balance between benefit and harm, and a real fear amongst, especially myself and my own colleagues, about making things worse. And that's really because, as everywhere globally, there's been a huge lack of understanding about the disease process, and also what impact it was going to have on our transplant patients. So yet again, you can see how uncertainty has become part and parcel of everyday life, especially at the moment. So how can us clinicians help patients? I think the number one thing is to accept that uncertainty is here to stay, unfortunately. But I think there are ways that we can learn how best to manage it. I think the first step is to understand and empathise with just how difficult it is for patients. I think it's really important to have good dialogue between us and the patient groups that's transparent and manages people's expectations well. I think education has a huge part to play, and I think there are ways that we could potentially improve education to help settle some of the anxieties and stresses associated with transplantation. The issue of risk presentation, I think, is something that's been interesting to me for many, many years now. And I still think it's something that we don't always get right. I think there are lots of ways that we can improve how we communicate risk to our patients. And sometimes some of the discussions really are very complicated, and we as professionals find it difficult enough to understand some of the risks that we're talking about. And I can only imagine how confusing that might be for some patients. Another area that is of interest to me is trying to encourage patients to stay well whilst they're on the waiting list. I've listed a handful of things there. I mean, the analogy that I usually use for patients when I see them in the clinic is a football analogy. And that is that whilst you're waiting for a transplant, you're kind of sat on the subs bench of a Premier League football team. And just because you're not yet playing the football match doesn't mean you don't have to go to training. And there really is a really important role for keeping yourself fit and healthy so that when you have your transplant, you have a much swifter recovery, and that means you can get on with your life far quicker than if you don't do that. I think there's also a huge role for trust and transparency, and I think there are ways that we can better explain why transplantation carries these inherent uncertainties and why it's difficult to guarantee exactly what type of organ that you may or may not be offered. I'll be talking about this in a bit more detail next week, specifically focusing on the issues associated with organ offering and what goes through the mind of a transplant professional when we receive an organ offer for a patient. I also think it's important for waitlisted patients not to feel forgotten about. I think sometimes we're at risk of this if patients are waiting for a long time. And again, this issue of having ongoing dialogue between both the patient and the clinical team to try and optimise that patient in as many ways as possible, I think that's always beneficial. And I think the other thing that we can do is to use existing data and research to try and help quantify some of the risks and try and provide some realistic expectations for patients. One of the things that we have available to us in the UK are some of these risk calculators. This is just a couple of them. This one at the top is basically gives you an idea of how what your chances are of having a transplant, either as a deceased donor as part of our sharing scheme, or if you are blood group or HLA incompatible. I've just put some of my details in up here, because I'm a blood group B. I can expect to wait perhaps slightly longer for a transplant than if I was a different blood group. So what do we need to do? I think we need to generally have a greater understanding of the patient experience. I think we need to focus on managing uncertainty and also devise some helpful strategies to help make life easier whilst patients are on the waiting list. How should we do it? I think research has a huge part to play in this. I think some qualitative work, talking to patients directly, listening to anxieties and fears, and then devising some collaborative strategies to try and manage especially the psychosocial burden of uncertainty, and also maybe some of the barriers to physical exercise and trying to get people as physically as good as possible. I also think, I very strongly believe that education is also something we could do a lot better at, and perhaps this is something that we again need to get some good data on to find out exactly what patients want to know and how best to deliver that to them. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. Obviously, I'm happy to participate in the Q&A at the end. And if you have any questions specifically for me, please type them in the Q&A box.
Hannah, thank you very much for your nice presentation. We know that uncertainty is very difficult problem for clinicians, especially today, and must be recognized as a persistent and a complex problem. People during waiting are generally burdened, and you give us some tips how to help patient. But from your experience, what is the best way to relieve uncertainty? Effective communication, helpfulness on information, or maybe a full uncertainty management program, or maybe we should combine every topics together.
Yeah, I genuinely think it's a collaborative thing. I don't think it's just one thing. I think a big part of what we do is and what I think we need to do well is manage people's expectations of transplantation. What can a transplant offer somebody? And also how does that individual fit into the transplant process? What can that person expect whilst on the waiting list, and what can that individual do to maximize the quality of their life whilst they're waiting for an organ? It's kind of, I don't think it's a case of necessarily pretending that uncertainty doesn't exist. I think it's a way of asking individual patients to say, how can we help you? What are the factors that are upsetting you or making you anxious? And can we talk about them and help you? Can we provide educational materials? Can we get you to discuss with another patient who's been through this experience already? You know, what are the different ways that we can help? And I think it's very patient specific. I very much doubt there'll be a one size fits all that would be appropriate for everybody.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, and we will talk at our webinar. Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Pisana Ferrari from Italy. She's background is in political science and international relations. She worked for a few years in European Union affairs in Brussels and in public affairs for Agro-Industrial Group in Italy. The turning point in her career and life came about with the diagnosis at age 32 of a life-threatening lung health condition, pulmonary arterial hypertension. Since then, she has been actively involved in patient advocacy in her own country, Italy, and also in European level. In parallel, since her diagnosis, she has been working in the communication and event management field. She underwent a double lung transplant 18 years ago. And Pisana will talk about uncertainty from the patient perspective. So welcome, Pisana, and the stage is yours.
Good evening, and thank you, Irena, for the presentation. It's a very big honor and pleasure for me to have been invited here today to speak about uncertainty from the patient perspective. I have no conflicts of interest to declare, and you're most welcome to share the content of this presentation with due credit on social media. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm a transplant patient and a patient advocate. I was diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary hypertension at age 32. I was just married and I was expecting my first and only child. I was 5 months pregnant. As we've heard from Irena, idiopathic pulmonary hypertension is a rare and still today incurable lung-heart condition. Over time, the disease progressed and eventually I had to be listed for transplant. I underwent double lung transplant 18 years ago and I waited about 2 years on the waiting list. I've been active in patient advocacy since 2001. That's the year in which, together with other patients, I founded the Italian Pulmonary Hypertension Association called AIPI. And 2 years later, I was a co-founder of the European Federation PHA Europe. In my career as a patient advocate, I've had the honor of collaborating with several professional societies, including the European Society for Cardiology, the European Respiratory Society, and now ESOT. And I've also co-authored a few articles for scientific journals and several hands-on guides for patients, including one on lung transplant, which you can see in the photo, and I'm holding it up. And in fact, my talk is based partly on this booklet, which contains information, very easy to understand information for patients to prepare for lung transplant, so before, during, and after, tips for everyday life, and a lot of patient testimonies. So the issues around my own uncertainty, I'm sure are common to many patients. I've listed a few. So first of all, I'd been ill for 14 years when I was listed for transplant. So there was a lot of mental and physical fatigue. And so that means I was a fragile person and my state of mind was affected, of course, from this, as is the case for anybody who's on a waiting list for a transplant. I was worried that I would deteriorate further and that I might not make it in time for the transplant. And that led to thoughts of death and sadness at leaving loved ones, in particular my daughter, who was only 11 years old at the time. I had concerns about organ and allocation criteria, especially because I had very little information about how it all worked out, whether people were called based on urgency or the time they registered, how things played out. So there was a big information gap there that I needed to fill in. And there were practical aspects I needed to sort out: my job, money and finances, my child. And the big unknown was how my life would be after the transplant, assuming it was successful. So the kind of survival that I could expect, complications, rejection, side effects of drugs, and also finding a new role for myself in this new life. So my overall approach to this uncertainty was, I would call it pragmatic. I guess it's because of the way I am and the fact that all my life I'd been involved in event organization and management. So I looked at this a little bit as something to organize, let's say. So first of all, I set out to learn as much of the medical issues concerned as possible. And I don't think patients need to have excessively detailed information, but they do need to have enough information to understand how it's going to work before, during, and after, so that they can better prepare for what's going to come, and also to better understand their body and understand, for example, symptoms and signs that could be important that they need to look out for. Then I had more time on my hands with respect to before, so I decided, I thought it was important to have some kind of a daily routine to give structure to this waiting time, so that I would not be just lazing around and getting deconditioned, as unfortunately is the case for many chronically ill patients. I set myself some small goals and did some self-reporting. I'll just give one example. At the time of my listing, I had my kidney and heart were not working well, so I had a very strict limit on how much liquids I could take in every day. So I kept a liquids diary, and then I would check against my target to see if I'd met, I'd met my targets, and that was kind of motivational and rewarding. It's just a small example. When you're listed for a transplant, you don't know whether you're going to be called in 1 day, 1 month, a year, or 2 years. So it was important for me to decide what needed to be taken care of right away, what could wait for later. And assuming, I couldn't take it all in, I couldn't take on everything, also lower my expectations. I also involved my family and friends in this waiting time project because I needed them very much for all sorts of things. And finally, I tried to be creative in trying to make this into a meaningful experience. By that, I mean that I had the time to reflect back on my life, on the disease, on my values, relationships, maternity, what the future might be like. So I did a lot of writing, and that was also helpful. Now, we all have very different coping strategies in difficult moments. If I have to summarize the ones that work for me, these are the 4 that I came up with. The first one was to connect with people or networks that could provide me the kind of information that I needed and the support that is vital in this kind of journey. Then I had to make a plan for practical preparations for being away, potentially a long time. Have some kind of a plan to keep as fit and healthy as possible, echoing what Hannah just said previously, because I did have a very serious underlying condition, but I was confident that if I tried to keep as fit and healthy as possible, this might improve my chances of survival afterwards. And fourth, how to try to keep a positive mindset. This is possibly the most challenging one, but challenging one of the strategies, but I did my best for that. So I'm now going to go through these 4 briefly, and then I have some concluding remarks. So concerning information and support, I think at a general level, patients today are much more informed thanks to internet, but they're not necessarily well informed. They may not have the most useful information or even the most relevant or appropriate. So I think it's extremely important that healthcare professionals provide patients with the right kind of information and encouragement and support. I was very lucky that this was my case, but it's not for everybody. There's more we can do together with healthcare professionals in that, and I'll come back to it later. Then thanks to my healthcare professionals, I was able to meet some other transplant patients. Now today, we all know somebody who's had a transplant, or we know somebody who knows somebody who's had a transplant. But 18 years ago, especially lung transplants were quite rare. So I didn't really even know what lung transplant patients might look like, if they look sick or there was anything particular about them. So this was a real turning point in my journey to meet other patients and learn firsthand and meet them and talk about day-to-day issues that perhaps that healthcare professionals might not necessarily be aware of. I also connected with patients from other parts of the world through patient association forums. Patient associations are very important source of not only information, easy to understand, but also to meet other people, to share experiences and give each other comfort. So I cannot stress enough how important patient associations are. And finally, and of course, family members and friends were essential with providing me emotional support. The second point is about preparing. As I said before, I'm somebody who likes to be organized. So I thought of this as, like a trip that I would be gone for a long time, and that I needed to make sure that people left behind would know where to find things and what to do in my absence. So that meant arranging things at work for my co-workers, sorting out my finances, settling any pending matters, filing away papers, making sure that everything was in the right place and the people looking for things would find them. Then I needed to organize who would take care of my daughter, take her to school, help her with homework and things like that. And as I was in charge of most of the admin work for my family, I also prepared a document. I think this is useful for most of us actually, and I still do it today. I prepared a document which had bank account numbers, credit card numbers, numbers of people to contact, contracts for insurance policies, contracts for utilities, and all sorts of very practical information that if I was away for a long time, people would need to have. And finally, of course, I packed the bag for the hospital, and I made sure that I would be ready for that part of the journey when the call eventually came. The third point is about keeping as fit and healthy as possible, and this is very straightforward, and it's actually very common sense, and we should all be doing it. But I think lifestyle advice is an important part of any self-management strategy, and definitely so for somebody waiting for a transplant, because it is important, to take care of it's about nutrition, controlling weight and liquid intake, taking the time to rest when needed, as needed, making sure you get a good night's sleep with help if necessary. It's not easy if you have a lung condition and heart condition because you can't breathe well, but that's something you need to make sure that sleep is extremely important. Then I tried to do some exercises, of course, within my limitations and under control of my doctor, and get some fresh air every day. I come to the fourth point, which is possibly the most important and also the most challenging, which is trying to keep an open and positive mindset. And this is not just for myself, for oneself, but it was also for my family and friends who I could see were sad and worried about me. And I didn't want to make things more difficult for them by being sad and miserable myself. So first of all, I tried to maintain an active family and social life. Actually, I tried to keep on working too as long as I could. But it's important also, I also very importantly maintain an active family and social life. And this includes family rituals like Christmas cards, birthday celebrations. I remember sending Christmas cards out in December 2001, and I had my transplant 3 months later, just to give you an idea. Then I tried to find ways to keep my mind off worrying about myself and about the future, and whatever helps there. For me, it was reading, watching TV, chatting with my friends, connecting online with other patients, and whatever works. But you really need to avoid just sitting there and thinking all day and worrying. It's very bad for one's health. And trying to enjoy the small things in life is something that is really important. Very often we miss out on the small things in the present because we're thinking about the future. So taking one day at a time and living more in the present moment is something that is extremely important. And there are things in everyday life that are very nice and that we should learn to appreciate. I was already doing yoga, so I did more of that, but in particular breathing exercises, because the physical part I had to do a bit less. And I also tried some meditation techniques, which I still use today. And I was often online with other patients or on the phone for support and sharing, people who were on the waiting list like me and who knew exactly what was what was going on in my mind and how difficult it was. At one moment in my journey, I was really doing not well at all. So I decided to get some professional psychological help, and it was very useful. And I think patients should not hesitate to do that. My concluding remarks. So first of all, despite one's best efforts, I really need to stress that waiting on a transplant list is like an emotional roller coaster ride. I had good days, I had bad days, and sometimes very bad days. When I was crying, I was depressed, and I thought it would, it was all hopeless. So it's very tough. And I found that coping requires huge amounts of willpower, discipline, courage, and support. And we don't all have that. We don't all have support. We don't all have the capacity to discipline ourselves. We're not all brave. We're human, and we need help. And it's a very tough journey. There are no hard and fast rules about how to cope. We are all different, but there's one point that I'd like to stress is that you really need a strategy. You need to manage this. You need a management strategy for self-management. And I think that's something that we can work, patients and healthcare professionals can work on together to improve the experience for patients who are on waiting list. I have two take-home messages. The first one is for patients, and it's to say that you cannot do it alone. It's too tough. So reach out to your family, friends, psychologist, coach, patient association, and above all, establish a good relationship with your healthcare professionals, an ongoing one, like Hannah said. You need to feel that you're not abandoned, and one based on trust. This is extremely, extremely important. And my take-home message to healthcare professionals is that it is essential to keep hope always alive in patients. Patients will hope against all odds. And that's what keeps them going. And I'm just going to give you one example to illustrate my point. Just after my transplant, I was in the hospital for about 2 months. And after about 1 month, my pulmonologist walked into my room one day, looking really downcast. And he said, "You have a rejection. I'm sorry to tell you, you have a rejection. It's very serious and we mustn't underestimate it." And shortly afterwards, my surgeon walked in and he said, "I'm sorry to say you have a rejection. It's very serious, but we have a very long experience with rejection and we have ways of handling it." So he was not lying. It's not like he said that everything would be fine, but he just, that the way he said it made the difference. Language really matters. And my final point is about uncertainty. Uncertainty is the inherent condition of man, and I think this helps to look at things from a slightly different angle. The best example is, of course, the COVID pandemic. None of us had any idea that things would change so dramatically in so many unexpected ways and on such a huge and global level. So I think you need to accept that some uncertainty is part of life, and it's part of the transplant journey, and it's part of the waiting list journey as well. And I'd like to thank you all for your kind attention and pay a special tribute to my two superheroes, the two doctors who really made the difference for me, who provided an enormous amount of support and encouragement before, during, and after, and still today, 18 years on. My surgeon, Professor Walter Klepetko from the Vienna General Hospital, and Nazareno Gallier, who's a cardiologist from the Bologna Hospital. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Pisana. That was a really heartening and motivational talk. You probably won't like it if I say it, but I think your bravery shone all the way through that.
Thank you.
It makes me feel quite emotional because I have had a little bit of some of your journey, but not the same journey, of course. But I think that any patient and any healthcare professional watching would be able to reflect that this is a very, very tough and difficult journey that you have lived, and you have lived it, you have lived through it. And right the way from, you've been very, very proactive. I mean, I love the proactive nature or the practical stuff, producing that lung transplant leaflet that you spoke about earlier on. And I would perhaps sometime I could ask you if that is still available for people. Perhaps it is, because you were showing it to everybody.
Online.
Online, great. Okay. Reflecting that mental and physical fatigue, sort of very, very realistically, and it echoed, of course, what Hannah was saying too. I think that, speaking about the fear for now and the fear for the future, so being scared that you may not have a transplant, but also being scared about what happens if you do have a transplant. So I thought that was very nicely summarized. And your suggestions for involving family and friends, for using the support that is around you, but using it thoughtfully and productively, I felt that was a great contribution as well. And sharing your coping strategies. The point that you made about patients often being informed, but not necessarily well informed. So there's something there we might want to talk about in the Q and questions and answers about good information and timely information. And I think we have some questions about that as well, actually. But those very practical points I come back to about sleep, food and exercise. Thank you for those. And your key points really about keeping hope alive is something that I think that many people waiting for a transplant, many healthcare professionals, you have that in your hands to be able to do, to help us with. And in my own job at the Kidney Patient Support Charity, Kidney Care UK, we hear that so much from patients. So perhaps something, as you spoke about peer supporters, about hearing from other patients as well, and what part they can perhaps play in this. And your key message there about don't do it alone. I thought those came together to make for an excellent talk. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And I think now what we're going to do is go to some questions and answers with the whole panel. And there's a few things at the bottom, and I've got a couple of questions, and I'm sure my colleagues will as well. But as I'm talking, I thought I would start. And perhaps so Anna Forsberg has kind of asked a couple of questions. So one for Pisana and one for Hannah, the same question actually. And it's about professionals giving information to patients. So perhaps if we start with Pisana. So how much information is good? What is the ideal way of doing that? So how do we balance between too little and too much? So Pisana, what's your view about the ideal way to be given? So it's necessary to get a lot of information, isn't there, on our journey? So over to you, Pisana, and then perhaps to Hannah for her comments.
I think the criteria is to give information that is actually useful, that is needed. That's what the point I made about that you don't need too many details, but you do need to understand what is going to be happening to you. You have to imagine that the level of health literacy is also not the same for everybody. So it has to be simple, probably progressive, like not all the information at the same time, but as you move further down the line. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat, so I don't see the question itself for some reason. I don't know why.
No, that's okay. It was just really about overload of information for patients being
The problem is that patients are going on internet and they find all sorts of things, and what you find is usually pretty scary, pretty discouraging. I think like statistics are fine, but they're better if you have somebody explain them to you and explain the statistics are an average, which doesn't mean, there can be the basics about what statistics really mean. I think you need to be accompanied. You need somebody to, I don't know if the word mediate exists in English, to filter that information. And it can be patient associations and doctors, ideally together. I think it should be a joint effort.
Great. And the questions are in the Q&A, actually. I said the chat, but it's the Q&A if you wanted to see them.
Yeah,
so.
And I really liked what Hannah said about collaborative strategies. I think that's very important.
Excellent. And so with that in mind, those points from Prasanna about the sort of the filter and the collaborative strategies, Hannah, what would be your comments on that? How much information, when?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that always strikes me is that when we put people on the waiting list, we sort of give them a huge amount of information, often in one sitting, and then we don't necessarily have any more discussions, especially as a surgical person. We get involved at the point of listing when they come and see us, and we may not see that person ever again. Firstly, it might be another colleague who's on call the day that that person gets called in for a transplant. But also it strikes me that we start having further conversations about risks and benefits and all of these things, usually 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, when someone's been phoned up. They're very anxious, they're very stressed. This is the day that they've been waiting for however many months or years. Obviously, they are really on edge about whether this is going to happen or not. And it seems to me that that's totally the wrong environment to be delivering what is quite complicated information. My approach, I think, would be to deliver education in a more modular way, to start off with talking about things like how does the waiting list work, and then talking about like drip feeding information about medications. And I also think that some of the information needs to be age relevant, gender relevant, whether you have children, don't have children, are you on dialysis, are you not on dialysis, all of these things. I think that it like I said before, it has to be kind of a bespoke package, if you like, and possibly we need to use technology better. We also have to acknowledge that people learn in different ways, people absorb information in different ways, and we have all this wonderful technology that we could use, and I'm not entirely sure we're using it in the best way. When I look at how my friends, I've got a lot of friends who are teachers, and I look at how they were teaching 10 years ago and how they're teaching now, it's totally different. And I think we perhaps could take a leaf out of their book and try and change how we deliver education, so that it reaches a far broader audience and is more effective.
Brilliant. And that sort of reflects a comment that I can see from Colin White about an over-reliance on sharing information verbally. So maybe, as you said, one piece at a time, a bit like that awful statement about eating an elephant. You have to eat it one piece at a time, but you can't, because it's far too much to take in all at once. And it is the elephant in the room, isn't it? The fear that we all have, and that overflow of information. So thank you. So Irena, did you want to raise a question? There's a few questions up there. Did you want to? You're on mute.
We have a question from Marlene. I think from to Hannah. What if the chance you get a kidney offer is so low that is almost impossible, And should you keep that hope alive or suggest to go forward with dialysis and put the transplantation aside? What do you think?
I mean, I think some of this is related to what I mentioned before about transparency. I think that there is no point in being dishonest with somebody. It is a very difficult balance between keeping hope alive and being realistic. And I think, you know, I think that's the kind of relationship where you need to kind of see the same person multiple times in terms of a clinician, because you build up a rapport with that person, you build up a relationship where you can have those conversations, and almost you need to together go through the different options, so that if you know there is a very low chance of a transplant, but that individual has time to accept that that is the case, but also to introduce hope into their lives in other ways. So for example, for a kidney patient, yes, okay, the chances of transplantation are very low, but how about why don't we try different strategies for dialysis to try and optimize that person's life and keep the positivity in their life in a different way? So is there someone who could have home hemodialysis, for example, where they feel that they are more empowered, that they have more control, and that they're able to live with the chronic aspect of their illness, and not necessarily be so reliant on a transplant to make their life better.
Okay, thank you. And in case of a highly sensitized patient, we should also propose, show the calculator, yes, of the possibility of transplant, yes?
Yeah, I mean, the difficult to transplant group are very, very challenging. Fortunately, I work in a unit where we have expertise in that particular area. I think one of the real important things is for transplant centres who don't necessarily offer some of the more high risk or some of the more challenging patients a transplant. I would always encourage those centres to consider referring to a centre that does offer opportunities for these patients. Because patients do have a right to having a second opinion, and it might be that with a little bit of collaborative work amongst transplant professionals, we may be able to get this person transplanted.
Okay, thank you very much.
There is a question for Pisana, if I may, which is an earlier on question, and it's about who is the best fit to give the sort of peer support or to help the patient. So is it better to help the support from a fellow patient or from transplant patients, or both, to guide you along, in your opinion?
I don't think it can be one single person. It'll have to be several people. Fellow patients were the ones that gave me the most useful and the most information, I have to say, especially those who had already had a transplant, for example.
Right, okay.
But it can't be just one person. I think you really need a support structure and information structure. You need several, not too many, but I mean, one will not be enough.
Okay, thank you. So a whole team, and
yeah, you need a team.
Yeah, and I can see another question that maybe Irena would like to.
Okay, so we have a question from Julie. And what do you think we should be providing more psychological support for patients during the journey and while waiting for transplant? What is your opinion? Both, maybe first, Hannah.
I think yes. I think this is something that I mean, I know our renal psychologists at Guy's are overwhelmed with work. It is an area which really is really important, and I think again, this is a way that we can maybe improve and change the way that we deliver psychological support. There's lots of cancer charities, for example, who utilize sport, and we know that young men, for example, have difficulties sharing their feelings, and that depression and mental health is a big issue in young men, especially young men who have health issues. And there are some groups, for example, who organise five-a-side football teams. And yes, whilst that's not necessarily ticking the box of, you know, seeing a psychologist, that experience of sharing, you know, it's kind of combining two things. It's the physical side. It provides you the psychological benefits of exercise, which are universally accepted as being positive, but also it gives you a group of people that you can talk to as a patient, who can support you and understand your condition. And a lot of my experience in talking to patients about the psychological aspects of their illness is that they feel that they're not necessarily being understood, or that we don't understand. And whilst I think we can support in some ways, I think thinking outside the box may be a new strategy for trying to deal with this, because it is a persistent problem.
Okay, thank you. And Pisana, what do you think about and what your experience about psychological support during waiting period?
Well, as I explained in my presentation, there was a point when I really thought I needed some extra help and more professional help. So I had a few sessions with a psychologist, and I found that it was very useful. And I think patients should be encouraged to seek psychological support if necessary. He didn't give me any medications, for example, but because I didn't have problems sleeping or anxiety. But for example, sometimes, you know, there may be some mild treatment that you can take for anxiety, and that's something that, well, you would need a psychiatrist for that, of course, but, or a doctor. But it's something that the psychological part is possibly the most difficult. So yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think we're out of time now, aren't we, Irena, for any more questions?
Yes.
I think I give the floor to you for any conclusion statement you may wish to make.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation about uncertainty. We know that especially during the COVID, this time is very difficult for patient and for us as clinicians. But I hope that today we will learn something about how to help patients, and also the patient perspective. So I hope that we will can work with our patient more effectively during this difficult time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Irena, and I would completely agree with you. I think we have had two fabulous talks from Hannah and from Pisana, and the importance of the collaboration, of the communication, especially with the pandemic, and the work of the patients as peer supporters and the patient associations together with our medical and clinical colleagues is so important now, but at any time, because the uncertainty of waiting for a transplant is always really difficult. So this has been a very timely event, and I hope that our audience, like I've certainly learned some things I didn't know before from listening and being part of this today. And so there's a couple of things I think that I've been asked to say, apart from thank everybody, and that is just to remind people about the learning work stream itself, the webinar series. So we have another event on the 5th of November, and there's a place that you can log into that, and also to the whole transplant learning journey program. So you can register now for that. But before we leave, there's also another poll, I believe, that's going to come up, and I've also got to talk about ESOT, so thank you for that. So this work, I should say, is part of the patient inclusion initiative, but let's just do the poll quickly. So could you just give us a quick idea of whether you thought this was helpful, and then I'll just speak very briefly about the patient inclusion initiative, which is something that started last year. Well, it's been going on for a little while, but we had a very helpful meeting back in the day when we could. We went to I think it was Copenhagen last autumn, and we came together and we agreed as patients and professionals that there is far more to be done through working together. There's far more learning and exploring together that could be done we wouldn't have known about that, that this was coming, that this was actually happening in terms of the COVID pandemic, but it makes it even more important to do so. So I'm very pleased to see, and I know my colleagues are very pleased to see this moving along now to this development and this learning journey. And then as we finish, thank you. I think we've heard from people that they seem to find it extremely helpful, very helpful, or somewhat helpful. So at least that means that we've spent the hour well, I hope, and that this ESOT learning journey, including patients, is something that is worthwhile to do. And I'd encourage everybody to get involved with that. This will be available to look up afterwards if you want to share it with anybody else. And I think, unless I've missed anything else out, and someone will tell me if I have, it's time now at the end of the hour to thank you all as our audience for taking part, for all your questions. Sorry, I think we probably didn't get the chance to answer every single one of them, but time is always like that. And to thank my colleagues on ESOT, on the TLJ, and of course the co-speakers and panelists tonight. So thank you everybody for all of your time, and I think it's goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks for your time.